Dear students, welcome back to the 9th online lecture of Money and Banking course. In this lecture, we will discuss chapter 16, which is entitled as Determinants of the Money Supply. Let's start with the main learning outcomes of this lecture. In this chapter, we will discuss the money supply model and the money multiplier. So, in this recorded lecture, we will cover the definition of the money multiplier, and we will explain the intuition behind the money multiplier. We will also discuss the factors that affect the money multiplier, which include changes in the required reserve ratio, changes in the currency ratio, and changes in the excess reserve ratio. Let's start with the first point, which is the definition of the money multiplier. And here, the money multiplier is the ratio that relates the change in the money supply to a given change in the monetary base. So, in chapter 15, we have seen that central bank can control the monetary base better than its control of reserves. Therefore, we need to understand the relationship between the money supply and the monetary base. And here, monetary base consists of currency plus reserves, as we have seen in chapter 16 and as appears in equation number 1. So MB here stands for monetary base and C stands for currency, while R stands for reserves. Recall from chapter 3 that money supply equals currency plus deposits. So we can write the money supply equation as shown in equation 2. M equals C plus D, where M here represents the money supply, where C represents currency, while D represents the deposits. And the money multiplier links the money supply to the monetary base as shown in equation number 3, where M, which is written here in uppercase, represents the money supply, while M, which is written in the lowercase, represents the money multiplier. So money supply equals money multipliers times the monetary base. So this means that money multiplier will tell us how much money supply it changes when the monetary base it changes, and the value of the money multiplier should be larger than 1, which means that if the monetary base increases by, say, $1, this will lead to a more than $1 increase in the money supply. So, in the remaining part of this lecture, we will explain the factors that affect the money multiplier. And here, as we can see in equation 4, money multiplier equals money supply divided by the monetary base. Now, to explain the factors that affect the money multiplier, let's assume that individuals want to hold a certain level of currency, which we can call currency ratio, and this currency ratio is referred as small c as it appears here, and it can be computed by dividing the amount of currency C by the amount of deposits available at banks. Similarly, we assume that banks want to hold a certain ratio of excess reserves, which we can call excess reserve ratio, and here the symbol E refers to the excess reserve ratio, which can be obtained by dividing the amount of excess reserves by the amount of deposits available at banks. And here we assume that both ratios, currency ratio and excess reserve ratio, have positive relationship with deposits, so they increase as deposits increase. So based on that, we can write the formula of money multiplier as shown here. M equal 1 plus C divided by C plus R plus E, where C here represents the currency ratio and R represented the required reserve ratio that is determined by the central bank, as we have seen in chapter 10, and E represents the excess reserve ratio desired by different banks. Now let's solve this numerical example that shows us how to explain the money multiplier and the intuition behind it. Assuming that the required reserve ratio are equal 10%, whereas currency in circulation equal $400 billion, the checkable deposits equal $800 billion, and excess reserves equals $0.8 billion. Then we need to compute the money multiplier. So we should start with finding the value of the three ratios: currency ratio and required reserve ratio and excess reserve ratio. The required reserve ratio is already given in the example and it equals 10%. So here we need to use this information to compute both currency ratio and excess reserve ratio. Once we get all these ratios, we can substitute in the formula of the money multiplier to get its value. So now let's start with computing currency ratio, which equal the amount of currency divided by the amount of deposits. So here currency equal 400, so here we substitute it here and we divide it by 800, so currency ratio equal 0.5. Then excess reserve ratio is the amount of excess reserves divided by the amount of checkable deposits. So here it's 0.8 divided by 800, so it's 0.001. So now we have the three required ratios, so we can substitute them directly in the formula of money multiplier, and M here equal 1 plus C divided by C plus E plus R. So here M equals 1 plus 0.5, which is currency ratio, divided by 0.1, and here this represents the required reserve ratio as given in the example, plus 0.001, which is excess reserve ratio, plus 0.5, which is currency ratio, and then the value of the money multiplier equal 2.5. Now, what is the meaning of this value? It means that if the monetary base increases by $1, this will lead to $2.5 increase in the money supply. Next point in this lecture is what are the factors that affect the money multiplier. And here we have three factors that affect the money multiplier as shown in the formula. These factors are it changes in the required reserve ratio, it changes in the currency holding, and also it changes in excess reserve ratio, where all these factors have negative impact on the value of the multiplier, as we will see in next example. So now let's see what will happen if the central bank it changes the required reserve ratio and all other factors are constant. So here we will use the same values as in the previous example, but here the only variable factor will be the required reserve ratio. And here let's see what happens if the required reserve ratio increases from 10% to 15%. So we already know the value of the currency ratio, which was 0.5, and the value of the excess reserve ratio was 0.001. So here we will substitute these value in the formula of money multiplier. So here M equal 1 plus 0.5, which is currency ratio from the previous example, divided by 0.15, which is the new required reserve ratio. And as I said, it increases from 10% to 15%, plus 0.001, and here this represents the excess reserve ratio as we have computed before, plus 0.5, which is the currency ratio. Based on these values, the value of money multiplier is 2.3. As we can see here, when the required reserve ratio increases from 10 to 15%, the value of the money multiplier decreases from 2.5 to 2.3. So as we can see, we have a negative relationship between the required reserve ratio and the value of money multiplier. On the other hand, if R decreases to say 5%, so here we will apply the same formula, but this time we will replace 0.15 by 0.05. So this is the new required reserve ratio. In this case, we find that the value of money multiplier is 2.72. So if we compare this with the original example, here when the value of required reserve ratio decreases from 10% to 5%, the value of the money multiplier increases from 2.5 to 2.72. So again, as I said, we have a negative relationship between the money multiplier and the required reserve ratio. Now let's see what will happen if we have a change in the currency ratio. Here, an increase in the currency ratio means that depositors are converting some of their checkable deposits into currency. And here, when they do this, the monetary expansion will decrease, because we know that checkable deposits induce multiple expansion of money supply, while currency doesn't. So here, when checkable deposits are converted into currency, there is a switch from a component of the money supply that creates multiple expansion to another component that doesn't support creating multiple expansion of the money supply, as we have explained in chapter 15. So here, let's see what happens if currency ratio increases from 0.5 to 0.75. So we will use the same values as before, but the only variable or the only factor that will change here is the currency ratio. So we will substitute the old values, but here we will replace 0.5 by 0.75, which is the new currency ratio. So we will replace it here and here. So here, when currency ratio increases from 0.5 to 0.75, the value of the multiplier declined from 2.5 to just 2.06. This means that when currency ratio increases, the value of money multiplier decreases. So we have a negative relationship between currency ratio and the money multiplier. The final factor that affects the money multiplier is the changes in the excess reserve ratio. So here, when banks increase their holding of excess reserves relative to the available amount of checkable deposits, the banking system will have a little amount of reserves that can support checkable deposits, so their ability to create loans will be lower than before. So here, they will create less loans and they will create less checkable deposits, which will lead to a decline in the money supply, and of course the money multiplier will fall. So here, let's see what happens if the excess reserve ratio increases from 0.001 to 0.005. So here, the only factor that will change in this example is this value that represents the excess reserve ratio, and in this case the value of the money multiplier declined from 2.5 to just 2.48. So as we can see, we have a negative relationship between excess reserve ratio and the value of money multiplier. And of course, all these factors will affect the money supply as it affects the money multiplier, as we will see later in this chapter. So I will stop at this point, where the rest of this chapter will be completed during the interactive lecture. So thank you for watching, and see you next week.